Good evening, viewers. Welcome to Cultural Remodeling program. This evening we are looking at the recent visit of the IMF Managing Director, Mr. Dominique Strausskind, who was in Zambia from 10 to 11th of March 2010. During the week he had so many activities. We'll bring them into the program as we move on. But at this point in time, I would like to thank Professor Mtari Chanda and his lovely wife of Lusaka, Mr. Vincent Mpoya of South African Airways, Dr. Kenneth Chawinga from Kawambwa, Mr. Mumbi, a youth from Fleur, Mr. Simlenga, I cannot remember which town he is from, but he made a very, very positive comments of the programs we've had in the past few weeks. I also thank students from Lusaka University, DMI St. Eugene University, and the University of Zambia. I'll explain why I'm giving special thanks to this group of students. But to wind up my thanks is going to Father George quickly, who is from Nigeria. He was in Zambia for 9 days. I enjoyed his homilies at St. Ignatius Parish, where he was giving the novena. We will look at the visit of the IMF Managing Director. But to begin with, let's understand the person whom we are talking about. Before we get there, however, let's just check out a data sheet that relates to Zambia and the International Monetary Fund in the next 1 minute. Watch with me. That's our data sheet on IMF operations and Zambia's position relating to the International Monetary Fund. The MD of the International Monetary Fund, Mr. Dominique Strauss-Kahn, is a French national who spent part of his early childhood in Morocco. Mr. Kahn commenced his duties as Managing Director of the IMF on 1st November of 2007. Before that, he served as Minister of Finance, Minister of Industry, Minister of International Trade in France. He was also a member of the French National Assembly. During his role as a government minister, he managed the launch of the euro in the Eurozone. In the private sector, he served as a corporate lawyer. He holds a PhD in economics and has other graduate qualifications in law, business administration, political studies, and statistics. He was a professor of economics at the Paris Institute of Political Studies. He's done research in household saving behavior, public finance, and social policy. This is the person that visited Zambia this past week and held meetings with President Banda, the Minister of Finance and National Planning, other sector ministers, and students, civil society, business associations in different meetings. Let's check out our report on the visit by the IMF Managing Director, Mr. Dominique Strauss-Kahn. Watch with me.
Mr. Dominique Strauss-Kahn, PhD, Managing Director, IMF, arrived in Zambia on Wednesday, the 10th of March, 2010. He was received by high-powered delegation from government and the Bank of Zambia.
It's 100 kilometers from here.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
yes, that's right.
yeah.
He told me.
Yes.
Yes, I remember. You know, Stan was born.
Fisher,
Stan was born here. Yeah. So he came. Yeah, I remember.
Mr. MD and your dear wife, you are most welcome to Zambia. I just hope that at some day in the future you come back and stay a little bit longer. There are lots of exciting things to see in Zambia. Lions, elephants, the Victoria Falls, and the nice landscape. So we hope that at some point in the future, either in your role as MD of the IMF or in private capacity, you can come back and enjoy the sceneries.
I'm here visiting both shareholders, clients. Maybe I'm also here visiting friends. Africa is a very important part of our concern in the IMF, and the way the different countries in Africa have coped with the crisis is something we're very much interested in. We tried to help, but at the end the different countries did well themselves, and the economic policy which has been put in place all across Africa, and especially in Zambia here during this crisis, is really commendable. You may find different kind of government in a diverse country in Africa. Some of them are members of the IMF, but nevertheless a bit at the border for some time, and it has been the case for Zimbabwe, for instance. We just go back to restore the voting rights of Zimbabwe, which had been suspended for a rather long time previously because of the conflict in the country and the fact that no real government was recognized by the international community. Now, besides this extreme case, we're working with all kinds of governments so far they're recognized by the international community. That's our rule. The United Nations, when a new government is in place, decide whether or not this government is representative of the people of the country. And when the United Nations decides that it's the case, we also do the same and see if our members, the member of the credit union minister just described, consider that the government in place is the right one. So we don't interfere with the color or the decision of the government. Nevertheless, you're right in saying that some may be more business friendly and economic friendly, and some kind of government may help more growth and development than others. The main difference certainly is the quality of governance. And if I have one point I would like to underline to answer your question, is that governance is certainly not only in Africa, it may be a problem in many other countries too, but certainly also in Africa. Governance certainly a key question to have a sound foundation for economic development. Good governance means a judiciary power well organized, means a clear definition of the role of the legislative power and the executive power, means fight against corruption, means also that periodical election may enable the people to decide what kind of choice they want to do. And it is not surprising that in country having a better governance than others, when you look at the result after 10 years or 15 years, the bottom line is clear. Growth, development, fight against poverty, all this goes together with the fact that those countries implement not only the right economic policy, but also the right way to organize the society. Nevertheless, we have to work with all our members, and except some very special cases as the one I mentioned at the beginning, all African countries are dealing with us. Some are more in trouble, some are less in trouble, but we're discussing with all of them.
On the second day of the visit, Mr. Dominique Strausskind held meetings with the President of the Republic of Zambia, Rupia Banda, economic sector ministers, the Minister of Finance and National Planning, and other high-level economic management players. Throughout his visit, Mr. Strausskind commended Zambians for the policies put in place to strengthen the economy and wave off the effects of the global economic crisis.
We've had many years of cooperation, economic reform, which is finally paying dividends. For the last 6 years, we are seeing strong economic growth. This is really unique since independence. We've never had it so good. So we appreciate that the role that you've played in this, the discussion, the reform, the financial resources that you've provided. But we also want to appreciate the specific role that you've played in the recent economic crisis. I think for the first time, many African countries, including Zambia, believe that the intervention of the IMF has been extremely positive. You've decided very quickly to provide resources. We now have more reserves as a result of the SDR allocations. We're able to spend more on infrastructure last year, as opposed to the olden days when we would have been asked to cut down on expenditure. And I believe that as a result of this partly also explains why we managed to grow the economy by 6.3%. In addition, of course, to other factors that we did take ourselves to protect our mining industry from the dangers of the economic crisis. To do this, diversification is important. We want to grow agriculture, we want to grow tourism, we want to grow manufacturing, construction, and other sectors so that they complement the mining sector that has been underpinning our growth so far. To grow these sectors, in other ways to diversify the growth, we need infrastructure. Our country is big. There's potential everywhere, but we need functioning infrastructure. Railway lines, roads, because for us to grow, we need to export. To export, we need to be competitive, and a large part of that is transport costs. We are landlocked, so we are really focusing so much on infrastructure, and this is where I believe that perhaps also you can help.
During the meeting, the Minister of Finance and National Planning also spoke of the need to pursue innovative ways of mobilizing resources for infrastructure development.
Contrary to our expectation that aid was going to be expanded, unfortunately, maybe because of the economic crisis, aid is not expanding. So cheap money as a form of grants and concessional borrowing is not easy to come by. So I believe it's a time has come for us to reflect on the definition of what is concessional borrowing. Also to take account of the reality that there are new donors, or new lenders who are coming on the scene who may not be able to lend in the concessional manner that the World Bank, for example, would provide funding to. But then what do we do? If there is not enough money from the traditional lenders, should we sit back and see our economy falter because of lack of infrastructure?
Mr. Strausskind spoke with a passion that reflected his great interest in seeing that Africa develops. He was specific with the interventions needed in Zambia.
I'll try to find a way once to come back at a more private capacity to be able to take advantage of what can be done here in terms of tourism. It will help the Zambian economies, not very much, but a little. But I certainly will try to take more time to visit your country. You've been kind enough to say that the way the IMF has helped Zambia and other countries during this crisis was appropriate, and I think that we react timely, strongly, and for most of the countries of Africa, maybe for all of them, the new facility that we have put in place, the issuance of SDRs, all those different tools, along with increased technical assistance, was a way to help you to cope with the crisis. Nevertheless, with the same kind of help, some have done better than others, and you did well. And the IMF is well known for having a harsh comment on its member when the economic policy doesn't go in the direction they believe is good. So that's just fair when our assessment is that what has been done was really the right policy to put in place, just to say it and to say it publicly. As you know, and you mentioned, one of the new policy we put in place is to make it possible for countries, even low-income countries, to borrow at least part of their borrowing on not only on concessional terms, but sometimes on non-concessional terms, depending on their debt sustainability. So on one hand, we try the first leg of all this has been the debt cancellation process. The second leg, already in place, has been the new design of the funds facility, and especially the facilities allowing a zero interest rate at least until the end of 2011, and we will see for the years beyond that. Now the third leg is to make it possible, when it is financially reasonable, to borrow from some partners at a non-concessional term, or at terms which are slightly concessional but not as much as it was before. And of course I understand that in your view, the more you can lend, the better it is, because you have a lot of infrastructure to build. We were just talking together about trading with Angola, which certainly could be very beneficial for the Zambian economy, while Angola is importing a lot of goods from far away, including overseas. But the question is the road. And so being able to build this new kind of infrastructure is certainly of primary importance for your economy. To do that, you need resources coming, if possible, at very concessional terms from either the IMF or the development banks, but obviously it may not be enough and you may need more. So we certainly can see with you that borrowing from any partner and at the rates which years ago would have been appeared absolutely inconceivable because much too high, is something that now we can take into account. How much, that's the question we need to assess, and I'm going to see with my team exactly what kind of level of indebtedness we consider reasonable. Of course, we will discuss this with you. It's a discussion that we have, a dialogue. Of course, it's impossible to consider to be totally at the other extreme and say there's no limit, no reason. If somebody is ready to lend to you, there's no limit, no reason why you shouldn't borrow. Of course, there is a limit. Of course, debt sustainability is also a part of building the future. Infrastructures are part of this future building, but debt sustainability is also part of it. So the question, of course, is to find the right balance with ambitious projects, not being too shy, but on the contrary, not being unreasonable. So this is, I think, the main thing we have to work out in the coming weeks, just to be able to see until what level our advice will be to go to avoid, well, on one hand, to allow the biggest possible investment, including with some new partners. Everybody these days talking about the role that China may play in Africa, and as I've already said, including publicly, they're welcome. The question is, of course, what kind of deal they're likely to have with the countries, and we are on your side to try to help our Chinese friends to have financing in Africa. There's no reason why the money they want to invest will not be welcome. It is welcome, of course. Everybody has to find its own advantage and its own benefit in those kind of agreements. So what I can assure you is that we're going to work hard trying to define with you and to push as much as possible the limit of what seems to us reasonable. Let's be candid. I won't say there's no limit. Just the point is to define rightly until which point we can go together. So that's certainly something that we're going to do in the coming weeks, so that you will be able to be in a good position to, I won't say to bargain, but at least to deal with any new partner. When you look at the African continent, I could talk also about North Africa, but let's focus on Sub-Saharan African countries. The situation is rather good. course, it has to take into account the consequences of the crisis, but owing to the state of the global economy, what's happening here in Africa looks not bad really, and contrarily to some past experience, Africa, of course, has been hard hit by the crisis, but is not lagging behind in terms of recovery, and recovery is taking place here at the same speed that it's taking place in the rest of the world. That's one reason to be optimistic. I've said yesterday, I don't know, the day before yesterday, that in my view Africa was back, and I think that's absolutely true. And the second reason why I'm optimistic has to do with Zambia directly. The track record you have in terms of reform, sound economic policy is remarkable, and the only hope I have is that we can go ahead with this kind of policy in the coming years. So we're really prepared. At the bottom line, we're really prepared to work with you on your side as effectively as possible. Again, we are not magicians. You're not magicians either. A lot of things are in the domain of what is possible. Something may be unreachable immediately. We have to define clearly and not to make mistake of what can be done, but there's a lot of things that can be done, and that's I think the work of our team for the times coming. But again, we have here some friend of the press. I want publicly to assess that what has been done before the crisis and during the crisis by the government was the appropriate and timely set of measures that the IMF could advise, and I think the results are now visible. You're back on tracks, and so now it's our role to be able to help you as much as possible.
After the meeting at the Ministry of Finance and National Planning, Mr. Strausskind paid a courtesy call on President Rupia Banda at State House. The President received him with warm hands.
I'm delighted that you decided to include Zambia among the countries you are visiting. I do hope that during your brief stay in Zambia, you will see our beautiful tourist sites that will leave a lasting impression on your mind. Your visit to Zambia is very important as it consolidates the relationship we have with the IMF. Zambia and the IMF have continued to work closely in defining prudent macroeconomic and social policies, and this collaboration is now bearing fruit. Zambia's economic growth since 2001 has averaged more than 5% per annum. During the global financial crisis, government implemented a number of measures aimed at mitigating the negative impact of the crisis, which were augmented by the support from the IMF. As a result, in 2009, when most economies around the world experienced a contraction, the Zambian economy grew by more than 6%. Other economic indicators such as inflation, interest rates, exchange rate, debt sustainability ratios, and others have similarly improved. I also wish to acknowledge the role played by the IMF in reducing Zambia's debt burden through the highly indebted Poor Countries Initiative, HIPIC. Before the reduction of the debt under HIPC, we were able to access funding under the International Development Association, IDA. Now that we have achieved debt sustainability, our access to IDA funding has diminished despite our huge developmental needs. This has limited the extent to which we can implement developmental projects. The above notwithstanding, the government remains committed to addressing the challenges of infrastructure and improving the business environment. We need financing at concessionary rates where possible, to build the necessary infrastructure. This is among the reasons we have looked to China for support. May I also take this opportunity to commend the International Monetary Fund, and in particular your leadership, Mr. Managing Director, for undertaking ambitious reforms aimed at enhancing the governance of the IMF and the economic well-being of your member states. These reforms, which are aimed at making the fund's financial support more flexible and better tailored to the diverse needs of low-income countries, including in times of crisis, and at enhancing the voice and participation of smaller economies in decision-making at the fund, are particularly important for countries like Zambia. I am aware Zambia has benefited from the reforms with the augmentation of the resources amounting to United States dollars 260 million for the year 2009 and 2010 under the Extended Credit Facility, formerly Poverty Reduction and Growth Facility. Be assured that Zambia will continue to observe with interest as you undertake these reforms and embark on new ones. Zambia and the IMF share a common goal of reducing poverty through macroeconomic stability, and therefore government will continue to work closely with the fund. The government looks forward to continued collaboration so that even more progress can be made for the benefit of the Zambian people.
After the president's speech, this is what Mr. Strausskind said about President Rupiah Banda and his leadership.
Let's be candid. Most of the credits has to be given to your government and your leadership, and the good policy have been put in place in this country, not only during the crisis but also before the crisis, when together with the HIPIC process you have implemented structural reforms and a budget policy and a monetary policy, which was exactly what was needed by your country. The result of that is not surprising. The result is the high level of growth that you experience even during the crisis, and our forecast for the coming years, at least for the coming year, forecast for 2 or 3 years more difficult to make, but at least for 2010 and probably 2011, our forecast was high level of growth, which is, of course, absolutely needed in a country like yours. But we have no reason to be the only one helping you, and as I have already extensively described, we see no reason to have any kind of reluctancy when we see other countries trying to helping you and making deal with you. And your recent visit to China will certainly be fruitful in convincing the Chinese businessmen and enterprise to invest in Zambia, certainly not only in Zambia, but also in Zambia. And we see this as a very nice development.
After the meeting at State House, both President Rupiah Banda and Mr. Strausskind and their teams were indeed happy with the proceedings of the courtesy call. last engagement for the visiting IMF Managing Director was a public discussion forum with business associations, civil society, students, the youth and other interest groups.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Leshe Kandeta from the Ministry of Finance and National Planning. This morning it is my pleasure to be the moderator for this very, very important program. This is a public discussion forum between the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund and the students, non-government organizations, business interest groups, and the media. At this point, I would like to introduce our very distinguished guest. This is the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Mr. Dominique Strausskind, sitting on my right-hand side. Mr. Khan is a very distinguished international figure. He served as Minister of Finance of the Republic of France. He has been a Member of Parliament, and for my colleagues from the universities here, you may wish to know that he was a professor. He taught in the university in France. He also taught, I believe, in the United Kingdom. He was an associate professor there, and he has a wide CV. Obviously, from his delivery, you will be able to know the person you are speaking with. Shortly, I'll ask him to make some remarks, but after he has delivered his remarks, what I would like us to do is, please, ask those questions which you've been wanting to ask about the International Monetary Fund and the global economy. But obviously, you have questions about the Zambian economy. You will ask those questions. As you rise to ask your question, there are two colleagues of mine from the ministry. They will give you a mic, introduce yourself, and the institution you're coming from. Mr. Khan will take 3 questions at a go, and we'll proceed like that. We'll have an hour to do this. We should be winding up by about 12:15, and then he will leave Mlungushi and leave Zambia at that point. At this point in time, it is my rare privilege and honor to call upon you, sir, to speak to the audience here.
Mr. Strausskind started the Mulungushi discussion with a presentation on the global economy and on some of the events and government actions which have contributed to the positive growth state of the Zambian economy.
My view is that we were as helpful as possible in this crisis. First, in being certainly the first institution warning for the depths, the possible depths of the crisis. And remember, a little more than 1 year ago, many, and probably in your own newspaper, have written that we may experience something as bad, as deep as the Great Depression at the beginning of the 30s. It didn't happen. We had a crisis. We're still in a crisis because it's not over. But it has been as bad as it could have been. So why? Because the right policy have been put in place, and this is not only because or thanks to IMF, but it's largely thanks to IMF. Your idea, most people's idea in the African continent, is that the IMF has been more harmful in the past than helpful. This time, not only we were certainly the first to warn against the crisis and to make it possible to react to the crisis through fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus, but also we revamped our toolkit in terms of a financial facility to be helpful and tailor our help to the need of the diversity of countries in Africa. For instance, for Zambia, we have adapted the way we're lending to Zambia, and we have been lending promptly with a high amount of money, and so it has certainly helped your country to deal with the crisis. Do you agree with this point? I'm not sure we will, but then we may discuss. Do you agree with this point that the IMF acts this time very differently as it did in the past? Question 5. Of course, even if you do agree with me that what has been done by international institutions like the one I'm heading, even so, most of the credits has to be given to governments and to policy put in place by governments. And when I look at what has been done by the Zambian government, I see reason to commend the government. Before the crisis, a lot of right policy has been put in place, following the debt relief, the very well-known HIPIC initiative, and these policies have allowed the Zambian government, as well as many other governments in Africa, to build some buffer on the fiscal side that gives them some fiscal room to cope with the crisis, and especially following our own advice from the IMF to put in place some new program helping the poor and the most vulnerable. So what has been done before the crisis, what has been done during the crisis, was finally probably close to the best policy that could be put in place. Do you agree with this, or do you feel that other policies could have been followed which would have given better results? Now, question 6. Question 6 is, the crisis is not over, even if the climax of the crisis is probably behind us, but there are still a lot of consequences, and especially consequences in terms of unemployment. Growth is coming back, but you know, growth is one thing. Development, education, fight against poverty is another thing. Growth is necessary to have development, but growth is not enough. So now, looking forward, we need to see, first, of course, the government of the country, but with the help of institutions like the IMF, what kind of policy we have to put in place to try to put the country on the best track, and especially in terms of financing infrastructures. The biggest need for a country like yours is now to finance infrastructure, to be able to develop road, power, telecom, all this kind of thing. If this is the good strategy, then the problem is how to finance it. And of course, to finance it, you may find different way, national savings first, of course, but that's not enough. Then help, aid, loans by international institutions like the IMF, but also, why not, help by some other countries. And you all know that one very big country in the world today, namely China, is willing to invest more and more in Africa, including in Zambia, and is about providing important resources to invest in Zambia.
After the initial presentations, it was time for engagement and open discussion.
In your Article 4 consultations with the government of Zambia, you rightly pointed out that one of the key challenges affecting our government is to mobilize domestic resources to be able to bring about this infrastructure development a reality, but also to help fund diversification programs. Would IMF come out so strongly in your advisory role to sort of urge the government to push strongly on its previous attempts?
My name is Chilufia Chileshe. I work with the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection, a research and advocacy NGO. My question, Mr. Strausskind, I think I've heard you a couple of times refer to the fact that in Africa we still have our view of the IMF as a harmful institution, and you have said often that that is a very old-fashioned perspective of the fund. But there are some of us that strongly believe that the fund needs to humanize. We need to see a humanization of the fund, and we're not seeing that quite adequately. And by this I mean some of the overemphasis still on inflation targeting, for instance, and so on and so forth. When do we see humanization of the fund?
What, in your view, are the correct conditions for use of interest rates, South African style or monetary policy committee style in the UK, or indeed the Fed?
Well, I don't know how big a part of humanization you can find in inflation targeting. And you're right in saying that economic techniques sometimes are a bit dry. But whatever the kind of monetary policy you put in place, you will be able to make the same kind of criticism. That techniques is one thing, inflation targeting in some countries of Africa could be the right policy to follow. For others, not having reached already the level of development and of sophistication of the financial sector where a monetary policy based on inflation targeting can be put in place, have to use other kind of monetary policy. But in both cases, the humanization of this is a bit a different question from the techniques that you use. Does that mean, and I exactly say the contrary, answering to you, to the previous speaker, does that mean that institutions like the IMF and following them, the governments should consider what they have to do in terms of economic policy, fiscal policy, in the case you mentioned, monetary policy, without taking into account in any way the needs of the people and what I believe you put behind this word of humanization? Certainly not. Certainly not. And one of the reasons for failure in the past was certainly this fact that what you may put on a sheet of paper when you're in your office and being convinced that's the right policy to implement may just fail because you didn't take into account what's happening to the people in the country. And one of the changes that my team, the IMF staff, the IMF board, myself, are trying to implement, have been trying to implement during the last 2 years, during this crisis, is to define the advice we're giving to countries, not only in terms of the right kind of policy to implement technically, but also taking into account the needs of the people. This crisis has shown deep weaknesses in our understanding of the global economy, and especially deep weaknesses in our understanding on the linkages between the real sector and the financial sector, and that's exactly the point where the monetary policy is concerned. So the role of monetary policy in the future is, in my view, something that may be discussed and where we may expect some evolution building on the lessons from this crisis. Now let me come back to the first question, which was a very broad question. First, I'm happy that you mentioned Article 4. And not everybody knows what Article 4 is. Article 4 is the Article 4 of the Articles of Agreement, which are the treaty founding the IMF. And this Article 4 defines the obligation for any member of the IMF to accept the mission coming from the IMF to exert surveillance on what's happening in the economy. The idea, of course, is not to be a police. The idea is that the IMF is a multilateral institution where all the members are around the table. Your finance minister yesterday defined the IMF as a credit union, which is a nice image. And you're all shareholders, all countries, and so the people of the world are shareholders of this kind of credit union. And so, if we want this financial solidarity, which is at the roots of the IMF, to work, we need everybody to be informed about what's going on in the different parts of the world, and with peer pressure, try to push countries going on bad tracks to go back on the right track. So that's what we call surveillance, and it's done under the regulation of this Article 4. And by extension, the visits of the IMF in a country and the report which is written at the end of this visit is called Article 4. So in the Article 4 about Zambia, as we have about each and every country in the world, this discussion about the role of copper and the necessity of diversifying, and the way to do it took its place. Of course, our role is to, year by year, to say how we see the economy going on, and we focus more on fiscal policy, tax policy, monetary policy, also some structural reform. The choices in terms of development strategy is more in the hand of the government itself, which is just normal. Nevertheless, we of course have some input, and the discussion that our mission chief has regularly with the Treasury and the Central Bank includes this kind of question. And so, obviously, even if huge investment have been already done in the copper industry, if a lot of benefits can be expected from this huge, rather recent investment, there's no way for an economy like yours to rely only on that for the future. And the future generation in this country is a very young country. The future generation will be very numerous. Those kids that you have today cannot expect to see their living relying only, I won't say even only on copper, but only on mining, not only copper. So the need to go further, the need to integrate with neighbors is something absolutely necessary.
I'd like to find out, as a student, what kind of policies the IMF, which policies you found that are not really working for the country and the people, and that you've actually decided not to use, or that you've decided to scrap off.
You mean what experience we have of policy not working?
Yeah, the ones that are not working well for the country and the people, and that you've decided not to use anymore.
My name is Godfrey Chewe. I'm from the University of Zambia. Thank you for this privilege, Dr. Ken. When you talked about multilateral institutions participating in ensuring that the aid development in Africa, I have a question. How would you suggest that countries strike a balance between borrowing and being pushed into more fresh debt, because this has actually been the problem for the past 2 decades in Africa? Then following that question, it has been generally suggested that your participation should increase, as in giving aid. It could be concessional or perhaps non-interest loans. But there's a school of thought that says aid should be cut from these African countries to ensure that we have governments that are more responsive and judicious in the running of their resources.
Concerning the issue of aid, we realize that you actually talked about improving our infrastructure and everything like that, but how do you think we can easily attain that when actually the aid that comes to our nations comes with conditions? They actually give us conditions and programs on which to channel our debts, the aid. Now what if those programs that are given to us are not actually issues that are very urgent to address? Don't you think that hinders development, and it would be better if aid came without conditions if we want Africa to develop? Thank you.
My question follows a statement that was made by Dr. Strausskind, who said that actually we are all shareholders. Now the question is, how participatory or consultative is a process that IMF adopts when it's trying to design policies for Africa? This follows the fact that we've seen that most of the programs or the policies that you've adopted are not actually working. For instance, when we are having the global crisis that just ended, the policies that you try to put across, or let me just say, when we look at the structural adjustment programs, they do not really reflect the problems that goes on in most of our countries. You want people to be laid off from work. You're looking at a situation where you want the civil service to be trimmed, and yet you don't provide alternative solutions that are going to provide employment for those. How consultative and participatory is your statement?
Being here in Zambia, it's difficult not to refer to one of your fellow citizens having written a very interesting book about this question. Let me tell you frankly, candidly, that I don't share this view. Of course, it's always easy to explain that without aid, country will have need to move themselves more, and that finally aid, at the end of the day, aid is more damaging than helping. But it looks to me as a very well-known argument in advanced economy, where you say, don't put in place any kind of safety net, don't put in place any kind of health insurance, don't put in place any kind of retirement benefit. So people will absolutely need to find a job, and they won't, and unemployment will go down. But all the progress in advanced economies, all what you want to reach now when you want to develop, is to go towards a society where you have this kind of benefits, where you have this kind of health transfer, of health insurance, of retirement benefit. Progress in human society is progress where you don't let the people swimming alone in the swimming pool, even if they're that young that they know how to swim, but where you teach them, you help them, at the beginning at least, to be able to develop themselves afterwards. Talking about countries, aid is the same kind of thing, and getting rid of aid will have a lot of terrible consequences on the development of African countries. Then the question is, okay, but you asked the question. Fine for aid, but aid come with condition, and wouldn't we better off if we had the aid without the condition? First, I don't think that you will be better off. Second, I don't think that it is possible to have aid without condition. First, why won't you be better off? Because when we take the IMF, could be the same for other agencies, when we step in, replying, answering, responding to the request of your government, I say your government, can be Zambia, can be whoever, it's because you have a need, because you're in troubles. When a country is not in trouble, there's no need to ask the IMF to step in. We give you the medicine, in our case, that's money, to be able to bridge the difficult period you're in. But also, we tell you that's the right policy you have to put in place. If you don't put the policy in place, then the same problem will happen in 1 year down the road. So what does that mean, aid without condition? Aid without condition is giving to somebody who is sick, has a bad liver because he's drinking too much, giving him some medicine, not telling him you should drink less. I understand that if you tell the guy you have to drink less, he doesn't like you. That's why most people don't like so much the advice of the IMF. But he's right in telling you this. And it's no use to give you medicine if you don't stop drinking. Exactly the same thing for, let's say, fiscal deficit. At the same time, we give you money to pay for this deficit because you need to pay it. At the same time, we try to put in place the right policy which will avoid a new deficit to come next year. That's condition. So I don't think it would be a good idea to have aid without condition. But another reason which makes it, whatever, impossible is that where is this aid coming from? It's coming from the credit union. It's coming from your fellow countries. It's coming from the international community. And they're not going to pay for nothing, letting you do, you, others, what you want, any countries, developed countries, low-income countries, just what they want, and asking, okay, now we have a deficit, just give us the aid and forget about the rest. No, they need to be repaid. Why? Because they need the year after to help another countries. They need to rebuild their cash balances to be able, as a credit union, to lend to one first and then to lend to another one. So the condition is also the reason for the condition is also to be sure that the country will be able, and after a period of time, to go back on tracks and repay. So for a purely financial reason, the second one, and for a very fundamental reason, the first one, condition is by definition attached to aid. Now the question is, and I'm not going to be too long on this, that condition can be good or badly designed. Condition may be too hard, impossible to reach, or well-defined. And that's what we are doing now in trying to streamline conditionality, to focus on what is absolutely necessary for the country to go back on tracks, and not to to consider other things which may be good for the country but have nothing to do with the problem at stake. So we are clearly streamlining, decreasing the number of conditions, but the conditions which remain are, in our view, the right one to be followed for the countries to go back from sickness to health. And when some of you are saying, well, obviously the policy put in place by the IMF hasn't worked in the past, let me tell you candidly and frankly, you're just wrong. If African countries were able during this crisis to survive and now to go back to growth rather rapidly, as I said at the beginning, as rapidly as other countries, it's because during the previous decade, growth has been strong in most African countries. And growth has been strong in most African countries during the previous decade compared to what happened in the past. Growth has been stronger than ever in the past because most African countries finally have followed not only the advice of the IMF, same kind of advice coming from the World Bank or other agency, but have put in place the right policy. So the experience of the two last period, 6-7 years of high growth until 2008, 1 year of crisis 2009, third period, recovery starting in 2010 going to 2011. This 3 period, before, in the middle, after the crisis, this 3 period shows that the policy put in place by countries following what the international agencies have advised, this policy were working.
Colleagues, viewers, ladies and gentlemen, you will appreciate that we've made an effort to bring to you all the meetings in which Mr. Strausskind and his delegation were involved with the people of Zambia, various interest groups in Zambia. Personally, there are a lot of things that I learned from those meetings. As I gave you the CV of the person that came, he believes in what we are doing and is happy with what we are doing. But as has been seen several times, sometimes we have no belief in ourselves. Mr. Strausskind and his group are an elite group of economists, if I may call them that. They look at a wide array of economics and economic affairs across the globe. So when they make those comments, as they made in this evening's program, we have to sit back, relax, and know that we are doing the right things. But let us pat each other back, on the back where need be, but where criticism is supposed to be made, let's criticize so that we build ourselves and move forward. From the evidence at the program at Mlungushi, indeed, the youth are willing to participate and to learn more about what is happening in our country. Let us help them to realize their dreams as future industry captains and future leaders. You saw how they participated at that Mlungushi program. It shows that they have the interest and the heart for this great country. My hat's off to all the colleagues that came from Daughters of Mary Immaculate St. Eugene University, University of Lusaka, and of course the University of Zambia for attending the program at Mlungushi. I enjoyed my time with all of you. Send me an email on seekandate@yahoo.com, or you can search for me on Facebook. Then we can have a chat on several aspects of economic affairs. We will see you next week at the same time. We thank you for joining us, viewers, and good night.